Welcome everybody. It seems a bit unbelievable that it's week 10, but anyway, congratulations on making it this far. Congratulations to anybody who's in the planning unit, 512, for submitting your planners report. We are ready for the next phase. So it is my great pleasure to introduce somebody who's kind of been lurking around in the background, who those of you who are doing the unit face-to-face would have met at Waterloo Crescent had not that been a day of torrential rain. That was a bit unfortunate. Anyway, I think that was a very good call on your part, Bunfu. That would have been very miserable. But yeah, I'm really so pleased to have Bunfu's help in this unit. She's a busy person, as is everybody who's working in stat planning at the moment. There's a lot going on. So yeah, we're very grateful for your input. So without further ado, if you'd like to take over and introduce yourself, and I'll mute and I'll sit in the background, but give me a hoy if I can be of any help.
Sure. Yep, thanks Emma for that introduction, and I think she's quite right in that I do sit in a little bit of the kind of the background and have been giving her some advice and guidance around the unit for the last 3 years, I think it is. And I guess a part of my role is to try and make sure that the unit is applicable and up to date, and make sure that what you guys get out of this unit is directly applicable in your jobs, whether that is a strictly planning job or more in the environment planning space. And so, yeah, I guess I help her with some assignments and making sure that the case studies that you guys use are a direct reflection of what actually happens in real life, which I'm sure many of you probably want that to make sure what you get out of this unit is up to date and relevant. So I guess from here on, one of the things that we are looking kind of more into is strategic planning. And I know the unit is core statutory planning, and so you probably ask me why I care about strategic planning. But hopefully after this hour, you can kind of get a better appreciation of how land use planning as a whole sits, in kind of the development space, and how stat planning and strategic planning are quite interrelated. And they're just as important and, to be honest, just as fascinating in different ways. Of direct, I guess, application is your rezoning report. That is your assignment 4. So we'll be going through that today, and I had set that assignment. So I want to kind of go through what I'm expecting from you and potentially give you some tips around how to actually address some of the grayed out hints that I had put into the guidance document. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about myself. I know, unfortunately, I was meant to kind of take you guys on the Waterloo excursion, but I called it the day before saying to Emma, 40 mils of rain and battery points probably not ideal. And so, unfortunately, I haven't actually got to meet you guys face to face. But like Emma said, I do actually work as a planner. So I started off as a graduate planner at Intura, which is the consulting arm of Hydro Tasmania. But in my previous life, I was actually almost going to be a chemistry researcher. So I did my Bachelor of Science in Biochem and Chem at UTAS, and actually went on to do an air sensitive chemistry research project in chemistry at UTAS before realizing that I probably wasn't the person I thought I was, and the lab didn't really suit me. So then I kind of reassessed what I wanted to do, and I went back to thinking about where I actually wanted to be, and it was actually the outside. So I wanted to be outside, integrating with the environment, with the built form, and with people, and that's kind of how I landed doing a Masters of Planning. So I've begun my Masters of Planning in 2017 with Emma, and yeah, so a couple of years on, it's really good to contribute back to the unit because it's still really relevant to me in terms of how I went through the unit and what I found, the gaps I found since I moved on, and hopefully making sure that we fill those gaps to give you guys a better experience. So you probably ask me, what is an environmental planner? And sometimes I ask myself that as well. And it's actually all things planning and environment approvals. So I deal with essentially a lot of legislation, mining legislation, planning and environment legislation, and making sure that the projects we do, which is generally your infrastructure and larger projects, make sure that what the designers and the engineers want to do, that is actually achievable from a planning and environment perspective. So not only looking at planning legislation and whether something's exempt or not, but also looking at things like your environmental values, heritage, and how they sit within the broader scheme of things. And I work across kind of mainly Eastern Australia, so Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and Tassie. Predominantly actually interstate work, but also I'm involved in quite a number of smaller local projects, one of which I'll touch upon, and it's kind of where the pretty pictures come from on the right-hand side. But the reason I wanted to give you a bit of an introduction is kind of to tell you guys that, coming out of a Masters of Planning could sound a little bit daunting at what you can actually get into. And I think a lot of people go, oh, well, what are my prospects? And we're going to have mute that one. So if you've just come in, just mute yourself if that's okay. So I guess I wanted to touch upon that. I've actually dedicated week 12 to talking about careers, but just touching upon that is stat planning doesn't mean you come out and be a council planner. It's way more than that. It can be as little as that or as big as that, but can be way more than that. And that's one of the biggest takeaways from my time in stat planning was actually it was the foundation to my planning knowledge, because it really is the unit that teaches you how the planning system actually works. So it can be dry, and I know Emma hates it when I say sometimes some things are dry, but it is, but go through it and just remember that this is the unit that really, really sets a foundation for your planning knowledge thereon. So I guess my day is a mix of strategic and stat planning and a bit of project management as well. And if you end up as a consultancy planner, even a council planner, you too probably tend to find yourself in the project management space, because as planners, you often look at multidisciplinary elements to it. So whether it's your engineering, your ecology, your heritage, and you actually end up often getting pulled into that project management role. It's very fascinating. I do encourage anyone who finds himself in that position to take it. And that's, to be honest, where I've learnt most of my, non-planning knowledge, is actually having to interact with those professionals and understanding how my role intersects with theirs and how I can facilitate something to happen. And also planners are, a mix of field work and office work. So, site visits are always good. And I always encourage anyone who has the opportunity to actually get out in the field, because it allows you a way better experience and appreciation of what you're working within. So as I promised, the two photos on the right are actually photos from Tranmere. So I don't know, those of you who are local may know that there's a project in Tranmere looking at the remaining land that is currently privately owned by a developer, or a family trust, I should say. And that is a strategic planning project that I have been involved in for kind of just under 2 years now. But it goes to show you that, realistically, a stat plan, coming out of a stat planning unit doesn't mean that you become a stat planner. You actually have a lot of opportunities open to you. And it's just about what you want to do and what your interest areas are. And a lot of the time, planning actually, has a bit of an involvement in a lot of different environmental related disciplines. So that's kind of enough about me. And unless anyone has any desperate questions that they want to ask me, I might move on to a little bit about strategic planning. So Emma kind of mentioned to me, some people will be asking, well, why bother about strategic planning units called stat planning? But I want to take you guys all back a little bit, to a higher level, and actually ask yourself, what is land use planning? And land use planning is essentially a balance of competing needs. And you're looking at things like the environment, you're looking at your social elements, you're looking at economy, and you're looking at employment. So you're looking at, and of course, climate change and sustainability. So you're looking at a raft of factors, and you're kind of going, all right, so I've got something here. How can I make sure we're balancing all of the competing needs of people and animals and the like? And how do you achieve something that is, you know, not necessarily perfect for either side, but something that's a meet me in the middle situation? And a lot of the time you will find that planning is very much about a meet me in the middle situation. So sometimes it's not about not doing anything or completely doing everything. It's about what can I do to achieve the best outcome for everybody. And I think that's where planning is fascinating, because it allows you to actually sometimes step back and go, well, what do I want to achieve and how do I achieve that? And that's kind of where strategic planning comes into play. Is that strategic planning, as it is called, it's more strategic. And it's about thinking through processes, assessment, identification of, you know, you're often thinking in advance. So you're actually planning for something that hasn't occurred yet, but you're, you know, basing on precedents, based on projections, trends, growth trends, and the like. You're forecasting something and planning for the future. And it can be quite, you know, sometimes it's daunting, sometimes it's exciting. Most of the time it's a mix of both. But it's about planning for the future, and it's how do you accommodate for the growth that is expected, or sometimes it's not growth, sometimes it's a decline in population. And that's what strategic planning is about. And then you have your statutory planning, which is what you guys have done probably for the last, you know, 8 to 9 weeks, is mainly statutory planning. So looking at regulation and the management of change with land use and with development, and, you know, thinking about how what you're assessing, how that fits within a greater landscape. And that could be, you know, landscape of built form, it could be a community, you've got, you know, also multifaceted. And that's why, you know, when Emma said to me, you know, make sure you explain to them what strategic planning is about, I think it's really important that you guys understand that realistically, strategic and stat planning actually intersect and are really interact with each other a lot. And a lot of the stat planning tools often have strategic planning measures sitting above them, and that's how you derive your stat planning. You know, for example, your zones and whatnot. A lot of the time, there's a strategic planning document that has set out something about growth of a particular area, and then you go down one level and you've got the statutory planning tools there to say, yep, that's the zone, that's the overlay, and yeah, and that's kind of how you get your stat planning tools, or your, you know, your toolbox, as I call it. And just kind of going to strategic plan a little bit more, and I've just kind of put, you know, this is a really, really quick overview of strategic planning, but essentially strategic planning is there to meet specific targets, or it gives effect to planning policy. And I will confess that Tasmania don't do our planning policies well. In fact, we don't do strategic planning very well. And having worked across a number of other jurisdictions, I can say that we're not very good at forecasting. You know, we're really good at looking at what we've got right now and maybe for the next 3 years, but we're not good at looking at things in the next 30 years and actually forecasting what we need to meet, you know, to meet the population growth of, I think it's up to 650,000 people by 2030 or 2050, I can't remember. So it's things like that. That's what strategic planning is about. It's about thinking slightly broader than planning, but then thinking back to planning. And strategic planning is really important to guide decision on a localized level. So that's where I guess the localized level is where your statutory planning kind of comes into play a bit more apparent, which is, you know, your zones and your overlays of particular you know, areas. And as I said, strategic planning from a planning perspective is used to manage and predict growth and facilitate the change. It's also used to coordinate you know, approach, because I think I'm not sure if anyone has a development background, but those of you who know would know that, you know, when you get a big parcel of land which can be earmarked for development, it's not just the development, it's not just putting the houses on there, it's talking about electricity, it's talking about roads, it's talking about, you know, stormwater. There's a lot of things that you actually have to coordinate to properly plan a town. And it's not often that you get to plan a town, so if you ever get that opportunity, please take it, because yes, particularly if you stay in Tassie, there's not many opportunities to plan a town or plan a suburb even. So it is quite fascinating, and that's why I raised TRAMI, and I encourage you guys to actually check it out. The private developer is currently undertaking their own master planning exercise called Skylands. And those of you who listen to the radio will probably have heard some of the backlash around that. But it's actually quite an interesting project to be involved in, and currently being involved on the council side, currently sitting in the background, but you kind of see where everything falls into place. And that is a really good example of how strategic planning is coming into play to coordinate the approach of something before you unravel, lots of subdivision and thousands of new homes. Strategic planning has probably a number of different tools, but probably the most common ones that you guys will hear are master planning and structure planning or precinct plans. And they're a strategic planning exercise. And often you'll hear developers go, oh yeah, I'm creating a master plan. That master plan will have its urban design components, but it will also have its planning component. And that's kind of, strategic planning at play. So before I jump into the regional land use strategy, I might just pause. I've kind of rabbled on for 15 minutes now. Whether anyone has any questions or comments? Silence is nothing, actually.
Yeah, I just wondered, with this strategic planning, would that be incorporated into the planning scheme?
No, great question. So yes, the short answer is yes. So in the planning schemes, you have what's called your zone objectives and your desired character outcomes, I think that's what it's called. Essentially, they're a bit more strategic. So they're your strategic objectives. So, when I mean strategic objectives, I mean, that's kind of from an overarching, a broader perspective, that's what the zone or the overlay or that's what it's trying to look for. It's not necessary. So stat planning is more about the regulation. So your zone provisions are more your regulation. Your zone objectives are more your strategy, so your strategic planning component. So yeah, 100% a good observation. So that kind of goes back to where, when I said that stat planning and strategic planning are really kind of they interact a lot, but often people don't talk about them. That's a good example of how they interact together.
Thank you.
Cool. I assume there's no other questions. So I'm going to jump straight into the regional land use strategy. And I don't know whether any of you have actually seen this document or attempt to read it. Not saying and put you to bed, so don't read it. But the regional land use strategy was something that they introduced, from my memory, in about 2012, I think, 2011, 2012. And essentially, there's 3 regional land use strategies. So there's your northern one, the southern one, and your cradle coast one. So cradle coast is essentially northwest. But they're essentially Tasmania's key strategic planning documents, and they set out long-term planning goals for the 3 regions. And within the strategy, when you have a quick look, and I do encourage you to have a look at what it looks like, is that the planning schemes are meant to be consistent with the relevant strategy. So, the Clarence one, for example, would have to be written in accordance with the Southern Tasmanian land use strategy. So the Southern Tasmanian land use strategy is for 12 councils. And so all your greater Hobart ones fall within the Southern Tassie one. And the minister's supposedly responsible for the 3 strategies to be kept kind of under regular review. And I say supposedly because we haven't really had a big review kind of since it came into play. We've had little bits of review, but not really a big one. And I think it goes back to my earlier comment about strategic planning and Tasmania, and we're just not very good at doing that. And it's not because people are not doing their jobs. It's just our system is not set in that way. And at the moment, we're kind of trying to retrofit some things, and we're trying to, Tasmania in general is trying to deal with a huge amount of growth, whether it's affordable housing or people migrating because we're a better place to live. There's a lot of reasons for that migration of people, but, to be honest, our planning system hasn't really kept up with that. And you will see things fall out every now and then that, prevent people from doing certain things, even though it's for the greater good, and because something hasn't been forecasted, well enough, which I'll touch on an example in a minute. So The reason I brought up the regional land use strategy is that my expectation is as part of your rezoning application, you actually look at the regional land use strategy and consider what components of that or what disciplines within that strategy actually should be considered as part of your rezoning advice. So again, you know, what you're writing is a piece of advice to the developer around whether something is doable or not. This is the contents page of the regional land use strategy. So as you can see, it's actually broken down into strategic directions, regional policies. And then within the regional policies, you have a range of different themes. And not all of the themes are relevant all the time. So for example, in a rezoning application, that's, you know, inland, you wouldn't think about the coast, right? But if you're looking at, you know, a big subdivision, a big rezoning, you would potentially think about recreation and open space. You might think about physical infrastructure. You might think about cultural values. That's when when you think about which one apply is when you need to think about your site. So if I'm planning, the example is if I'm using an inland site and I've got no coast, then you don't even need to think about the coast. So that's when you need to start thinking about what disciplines apply and which don't. And again, these are strategic statements, they're strategic policies. That's not to say you must do something, it's around guiding what should be done. And I think that's where the difference is with strategic and stat planning. Is strategic is about guidance and it's about saying what should be done, whereas stat planning is saying, you know, if your building is greater than 9 meters tall, you can't do it. It's different. So that's where strategic and stat planning are slightly different. The reason I pulled out this contents page as well is to kind of show you the breakdown. These are kind of the key elements that we often think about from a planning perspective. So, you know, things around flora and fauna, things like water management, so water resources. You know, where there is the coast, you know, how does your development actually affect the coastline? Because we all know that, you know, coastlines are prime open space areas, but not only that, there's often, you know, heritage or natural values associated with the coast. And so that's when you have to, you know, think about what applies and what doesn't. So these themes are quite common, things like social infrastructure and physical infrastructure, very common planning problems. And then you've got tourism and strategic economic opportunities that also have a planning element to them. So that's kind of that. The other thing I wanted to really pull out, and from my memory I had written in the guidance, is the urban growth boundary. So the urban growth boundary was introduced as part of the regional land use strategy. And it sets out the physical extent for a 20-year supply of residential land with the name of a 50-50 greenfield to infill development ratio. So when we mean infill, we mean things, you know, for example, okay, this just for argument's sake, I want to be able to say 4 houses right in the middle of town, you know, for example, might be converting an old warehouse. That would be your kind of infill development. Your greenfield development will be things like, you know, great block of land, you know, massive block of land out at Trammy, and I can put 20 lots in there. So that's kind of where the difference is with greenfield and infill. So the urban growth boundary has been set based on that rationale, and it was set based on a number of things, and a values and opportunities assessment was undertaken around capacity infrastructure, environmental stuff, landscape heritage, and land hazards. And so when we talk about land hazards, we're thinking things like landslip, bushfire, tsunami to a certain degree, kind of flooding. These are kind of things that, you know, think what's in the overlays, and they're the kind of things that you would think about. Now, the funny thing about the urban growth boundary is that, and if you've kind of kept an eye on the media, you may have seen some news about it, is that the urban growth boundary was introduced as it's a strategic planning tool after all, but people have taken it to the T. So people zoom in and they go, this boundary doesn't, you know, my house sits on the other side of the boundary, you can't do anything. And that's where the urban growth boundary has failed a little bit. And a classic example is a subdivision in Clarence, where literally it's on the other side of the fence. It wasn't allowed to be done because the development site didn't sit within the urban growth boundary. So the reason I pulled out is because it's where a strategic planning tool has actually been taken down to the T and mandated, and that was not the original intention. However, I guess as a region, we're waiting for kind of a big review to kind of fix that problem, but it has caused some grief for some developers. So in my previous role, I actually worked for a developer. I worked for a consultancy firm that was working for a developer doing something that was literally on this side of the urban growth boundary. What happened is we needed to write to the minister and actually get the minister to amend the boundary before we could even lodge a rezoning application and subdivision. So the urban growth boundary, that's kind of why it's there, but it has been kind of overly used or overly mandated beyond what it was actually originally set for. So the reason I pulled it up is because as part of a rezoning advice, it would be expected that you guys have a think about whether the Gilston Bay site sits within the Greenfield Development Precinct, which is essentially the greyed out areas, and whether it sits within that, because potentially if it sits outside of that site, then you have a lot more than just handing a rezoning application. You might need to lobby the minister around getting something changed before you can then lodge a rezoning application. So that's kind of why I pulled it out. And my handy tip would be that you have a think about where your site is located and make a comment about whether it's within the urban growth boundary or not. Hopefully that makes sense. So before I jump into the rezoning and go through the rezoning application with you guys, are there any questions?
Bunfi, can I just ask back on the Southern Tasmanian Regional Land Use Strategy, if its intention is to be sort of, I guess, the overarching strategic document for local councils, does it kind of appropriately address climate change and things like that in regards to land use planning?
Great question, Tom. You're 100% right in terms of its original intention as an overarching document. And that's where some of the blurred lines have now come in, particularly with things like the Greater Hobart Vision. So, it's almost like, is it one thing and then another thing, or is it two things in parallel? It's like, how do these strategic documents sit within each other, I guess, together, and how do they interact with each other? The idea of this, the Southern Tasmanian Land Use Strategy is definitely light on the climate change stuff, and that has been recognised in terms of rising water levels, and how does that, for example, how does that affect coastal communities and or big land developments or big land releases that are close to the water, and that is one area where it has been a little bit light on. The other area is bushfire. So basically the Southern Tasmanian Land Use Strategy is a little bit light on from a hazards perspective, and that has been recognised across the industry. And that's why, to a lot of people, and once you guys kind of start working in this field, you'll probably hear people say that the Regional Land Use Strategy doesn't really work because it's more a snapshot document. But unfortunately, that's what we've got to work with. And it's, and that's when you have to apply a little bit of common sense, like particularly when you're providing advice to, clients. And I have done that before, where you go, yep, while the strategy doesn't address this, this is something that you would have to consider. And that's where you have to apply a bit of a strategic planning brain, and think about issues that are prevalent, and that would be, should be addressed, that aren't necessarily addressed in the strategy. And a lot of them are, you probably control F and you'll probably find the word climate change a couple of times, but you'll realize that the strategic directives are quite light on, and they don't really actually provide guidance per se. It's more just pointing out that it's a problem, which, we all know it's a problem. So that's a great question, great observation. And it's going to be interesting. So it's due to be reviewed in the next 3 years. So it'd be really interesting to see what they do, how they restructure this regional land use strategy a bit, now that we've had 10 years of it in play, and realizing where the shortfalls are essentially with the strategy. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you, Bunfi. That's great.
No worries.
I think it's worth, impressing what a good question that is and how important it is that we get updates to the regional land use strategy. And certainly when I was working it as a transport planner for a not-for-profit, the inadequacies around the vision in the strategy around sustainable transport, around environmental sustainability generally, and that included climate change, really just not up to scratch. So Bumfrey and I both sit on Planning Institute's Policy Advisory Committee for Tasmania. It's a committee that Bumfrey chairs. Pretty much every submission that we write, whether it's about housing or transport or what it is, we recommend that the government update the regional land use strategies as a priority. And I've just been poking around the page, and under the Tasmanian Planning Reform page, there is an update about amending the regional land use strategies. That document was written in January 2019. So I'm afraid nothing much has happened, and even the document about updating the strategies is very old. So with the Tasmanian planning system coming in, this is just so urgent and so important. And just to highlight one of the other things that Bumfrey said as being incredibly important, Tasmania is kind of doing things arse end around where we're not good enough on strategic planning, particularly in the context of climate emergency. And that's kind of letting the whole thing down. So I would encourage you to have a bit of poke around. As recently as August last year, there was a talking point in the Mercury about the land use strategies being so out of date that it cites peak oil as a concern. Anyway, I just wanted to jump in and emphasise all these points about this being important.
Yeah, and I think maybe it can use another example of not southern Tassie, but northern Tassie. So one of the things that are really prevalent now in northern Tasmania, northwest Tasmania, is a lot of big infrastructure developments, and they are generally multi-council. The project itself might be located in one council, but the effect of, mainly in the construction, so the construction effect generally affects multiple councils. And that is one of the things where a lot of the northern councils are very supportive of those developments because they bring in a lot of economic and social benefits, but you don't get a lot of guidance within a strategic planning document around how, from a planning perspective, how are those areas identified. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about energy and infrastructure, and it's one of those things which really has a regional effect, and you get very little guidance from those documents. So how are appropriate land actually, whether it's been zoned out or whether it's been, kind of put aside, how does that process work? And when you think about kind of how Victoria and New South Wales have done their planning system, and they've got a much stronger strategic planning framework, I think is the way to do it. So I think Tasmania has a long way to come, but in saying that, we generally, as a lot of our insiders will say, we're about 10 years behind Victoria. So, our planning system is moving to a statewide planning system about, by the time it will be fully implemented, probably about 8 to 10 years behind Victoria. So I think we have a lot to look forward to. It's just unfortunate when you're trying to do something now, it does have its shortfalls. Like I said before, the project where I was working on, and you'll find it online, it's called 22 Atkins Street in Rokeby. It's essentially on the other side of the urban growth boundary. The pain that we had to go through with that is a classic example of how the document's not quite written in a way that has forecasted the growth. And part of it has also been that Tasmania's probably grown a little faster than people have expected, probably also thanks to COVID. But there's a raft of issues that come with that, and we just don't respond very well. But then you think about the way that our planning departments are set up. So Victoria have, the Victorian Planning Authority, VPA, which is the strategic planning. It's a whole department, bigger than our biggest planning department, and that's all they do is strategic planning. Except, we've only got a planning policy unit which has like 4 people in it. So when you think about the resourcing and whatnot, we definitely are punching above our weight, but still not quite good enough. So on that, I might kind of get to your planning. I've called it planning application. It should really be planning advice, sorry. So your assignment 4 is a rezoning advice. And hopefully you guys have had a look at 78 Gilston Bay Road. Hopefully you guys went out to site, from my memory. And those of you who haven't been out to site, it's, if you are local, it's pretty accessible and you can go by yourself and walk around the public track. Otherwise, Google Maps does a pretty good job as well. So the task that you're set to do is essentially you're providing some advice to the developer, and they are looking to rezone the land from the current zone to general residential. So it's within the Clarence area, so it's under the Clarence interim planning scheme. Now, while it's not part of your scope to think about the subdivision component, I'm just adding in there that they have intentions to subdivide the site. So basically it's, subdividing lots to create more, from one lot to more lots. Quite common for developers to, whether it's inherited a big block of land or whether they've bought a big block of land, to then subdivide and, essentially make more money out of it. It's quite, people make their living out of that. But your job is essentially to provide advice and recommendation as to whether you think it is feasible from a strategic and a statutory perspective. So when I mean strategic and statutory perspective, I'm expecting that you think through what strategic documents may apply. So think regional land use strategy, think state policies. So there's 3 state policies which hopefully you guys have heard of. Do any of them apply? Do we need to consider the agricultural state policy, for example? So think through those things and list that in your advice. The reason we've set this task is because we often get people who say, they want to do assignments that are more relevant to planning problems. And I can attest to that, given that I actually went to my first job about a month after I finished that planning. So it was a pretty quick transition for me. And often you do go, wow, like uni and industry is quite different. And so the purpose of setting this assignment is you often do get people who come up to you and go, whether you're sitting on council bench and you're the duty planner on the, responsible for the phone and people walking in, or whether you're a consultancy planner and you get paid to actually provide some advice, people will come to you and go, I've got this block of land, what can I do? Or I want to do this, can I do it? Do I need a permit? So it's about thinking through these kind of planning problems. And often, you'll get them. And to be honest, once you become a planner, you'll get friends who ask you that. People often call me up and go, well, I've got this house and I want to extend it. Can I do it? And you go, well, sorry, no. Or you go, well, you can, but you've got to do this and this and this. So it's actually a really, it's a really good exercise to set up these scenarios. So this one is a made up scenario. The developer, I think, wanted to sell the block of land. I don't think they're actually looking to subdivide, because you may have heard they wanted to do the eco pods. So this is a made up scenario, and I stress here that there is no right and wrong answer. It's about the advice and how you can justify your advice. So I'm looking at how you've interpreted the strategic documents. Have you understood what strategic planning documents are there for? And have you identified the parts of the regional land use strategy, for example, that might apply in this case? So yeah, it's important to note that there is no right or wrong answer, and it is very much about how you can put what you've learned into play. So hopefully you've seen this guidance document, but essentially I just wanted to break it down and kind of, knowing that it is relatively new for you guys, and then probably you've never done something like this, to step you through what I expect. So a very common, how I've structured your, the guidance structure, I think that Emma might have sent out. This is generally how we would structure a piece of advice, whether it's in a letter form or report form to a client. So you often, the first thing you do is you define what you're actually doing. So what have you been engaged to do and what are you achieving out of that? What's the purpose? You then break it down and then you go step one down, you actually break down into your regional and your local context. And that's very important in setting the scene of whether something can be done or not. So when we think regional context, we're often thinking broader than just the immediate area. So in this regard, the regional area could be Clarence. It's definitely not Gilston Bay. That would be your local context. So local context is about where that, where the site is essentially, and what suburb is there. Regional context is looking at a broader thing, and it's looking at, well, what is the area, am I, for example, if I was to say the regional context of a development in Richmond would be that it's mainly farmland, right? It's mainly farmland and tourism. So what I expect you guys to do is to give a brief discussion of what Clarence is about. Is Clarence a mix of, urban and semi-urban things? What have we got in Clarence, essentially? Have we got a lot of land that's undeveloped? Do you see large parcels of land? So, thinking things like, giving you a bit of extra hint, to be honest. So things like Glebe Hill would be a classic example of big developments that are happening in the Clarence area, and that relate to, rezoning, because Glebe Hill back in 20 years ago would have had to be rezoned as well. So it's thinking things like, what is the broader regional context and what are you working within? Yeah, and then you go into your local context, as I was talking about, how do you actually get to that site? Is it just by one road? Do you have multiple roads? That's the kind of things you need to be thinking about. And then you go through your environmental matters, and that really is just, I don't expect a lot. I don't expect you to summarize every report, but I'm expecting a brief a summary, or at least an outline of what you foresee the environmental matters might be. So, for example, this of course doesn't apply to this, but is it a koala habitat, for example? If it is, well, then we're probably in trouble. And these are the kind of things you need to make your clients aware, because they may not know better. So, brief summary, for example, flora and fauna, heritage, and as far as I'm aware, those reports are available. Is that right, Emma?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So you have all the information you need. I don't expect you to be doing your own research. And then you step through the actual proposal. So, your developer has, your client or your proponent, whatever, have given you a problem that you need to deal with. So you step through what the proposal is and what the legislative requirements are. And that's when it starts to get a bit more difficult, and you have to think through what kind of things do you need to consider. Do you need to consider LUPA, so the Land Use and Planning Approvals Act? Any of the state policies, do they apply? What parts of the scheme would be considered? Think about what zone it's currently in and what zone it's moving to. And, do you think, for example, if you're putting general residential in land that is already, in surrounding areas that has already got general residential, that would be a continuation of that zone character. Is that what we're thinking? Or are we trying to put a block, say 6 houses of general residential in what is largely farmland? So you've got to start to think through what parts of the scheme actually apply and what you need to consider. You also need to think through things like, in the general residential, given that that's where we're moving, are there particular parts of the scheme that would trigger additional work, for example? So, for example, if it's saying that, and this is completely making it up. So, for example, if you've gone onto the list, which hopefully you guys know how to use, pull up the what's called biodiversity protection area overlay, and you realize that there's all this threatened vegetation. Well, then you might need to additionally think about what code might apply. Does it mean you can't remove some of those? That's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. So you're actually stepping through, you're demonstrating that you understand how the planning tools work on a problem. Then you talk about your policy considerations, and I've yeah, given you guys a bit of a hint around, the regional land use strategy, that is mainly the policy document that you would need to consider. Generally, in a real life advice, you would actually go through all of the current policies, and there are a raft of them, but I don't expect that you give me a summary of that, as that would be probably too much work. So I am looking at how you have, digested the Southern Tasmanian Regional Land Use Strategy, and whether you're able to make reference to relevant parts of that strategy, urban growth boundary, what kind of strategic directions do you need to consider? And a part of it is, does the region even need more land? So, there's figures in the regional land use strategy that talk about the potential, how many blocks are required, what's the percentage, and of course it is, when I mean it's a make-up scenario, because, the number that was in that document applied, was applicable 10 years ago. We're 10 years down track, but it's kind of showing me that you actually understand how that strategy works and why it's useful, or why it needs to be considered. Not really useful, but it has to be considered. And then the final part of that is coming up with a justification. So you've thought through the problem, you've thought through what the planning scheme provisions are, and you've thought through all the strategy and policies. Do you think that the rezoning, if they were to submit a rezoning application, whether it's viable? And you have to provide a justification. So don't just tell me yes or no. If you think it's doable, give me a reason. Maybe it is within the urban growth boundary, for example, and that there is a demand for land, and that, the things like, rezoning to general residential would be generally in accordance with the surrounding area. That would, and I don't expect a page-long justification. And the whole point is, I'm looking for a succinct summary. I'm looking for advice. And I can't make it, any more clearer than saying that, I don't like to read long documents, because a lot of the time a long document can actually be succinctly written into a neat short document, and that would be better money than a long document. So make sure, don't feel like you need to exhaustively give me 20 pages. That's not what I'm after. And please do not copy large portions of the document into the assignment. You make reference to sections. And, if there's really an important phrase, you just highlight that phrase. So please don't start copying pages of stuff into your submission. And if you think that it's not viable, tell me why it's not viable. Why do you think it's not going to be successful if they lodged a rezoning application into council? So I'm not sure if you guys are aware of the actual process with rezoning. So in a real life, if you were to do a rezoning application, you write a rezoning application, you actually give it to council. So you submit it to council, and as full councils, including the aldermen, they would then consider whether they want to initiate that rezoning process. So they want to initiate that rezoning process. The actual full process sits with the Tasmanian Planning Commission. And they do the hearings, they go through the actual rezoning application itself. It doesn't actually sit with council. Council get consulted, but they don't actually go through the application process. That's kind of, I just wanted to take the time to kind of step through that assignment a little bit, knowing that this is new for you guys, but also kind of give you a little bit of guidance as to what I'm expecting and the level of detail that I'm expecting. So hopefully you got the hint that I'm not expecting pages and pages worth of things. I'm expecting a succinct essentially a succinct piece of advice as to whether you think that it's rezonable or not. I just put the rubric out there. Put it out there. I'm a very fair marker, and generally it's hard to annoy me, but I will get annoyed if you start copying pages and pages of things out. So please don't do that. But I'm about concise and good writing. And when I mean concise and good writing, I mean, have you actually logically put out your statements? Do you know what you're doing? And can you summarize it in a well-structured way? And so that's what I'll be looking for. And hopefully, I would say that I think the hints that I've given you you guys should do pretty well on that. And hopefully if you take the time to have a look at the regional land use strategy, get your head around some of the issues that you need to be thinking about, then I think you guys you'll do quite well. on that, I think that was it. And then I've got a final plug, but I'll see if anyone has any questions first before I finish off. Anyone have any questions? Sorry, I do realise I went through this really quickly, so hopefully it made sense. But I am around for questions, so I'm rarely at uni, to be completely honest with you, but I will be there. I'm always available via email, so you just send Emma your questions and she'll flick them through to me. If any of what I've said doesn't make sense, just voice out now or later, and hopefully the content we've gone through today puts you in a good position to actually tackle this rezoning advice.
And just to remind everybody that Bunfield will be back in week 12, both in the 3 o'clock session and in 4 o'clock in chemistry. So there's time to let this sink in, but you need to be pretty actively working on it in week 12. So we expect questions then. Then week 13 is given over to questions about the rezoning. So on that Wednesday, you'd still have another 5 days before it's due. So yeah, you will be supported. And for the surveyors listening to this later, we understand that because this is 70% of your assessment, not 30%, that you might be particularly motivated to ask questions. Only one of the 11 of you has asked for an evening session in week 12, so that's not going to be feasible to run. But yeah, please do ask when you run into trouble, and sooner rather than later.
And I'll just add, for the surveys out there as well, a lot of the time, and particularly kind of if you look at the trend now, so a lot of the surveying companies actually require planners. And if you look at PDA, they've really picked up their game in the last couple of years around hiring more planners to provide that advice to clients, because a lot of the time a developer will go to a survey and go, hey, look, I've got 4,000 square meters. I want 12 blocks on there. How can I make that happen? And a surveyor doesn't just go, oh yeah, I'll go out and peg it, or I'll go onto my software and draw it out. There's a lot of things you need to consider. So you have to consider, minimum frontages and things like that. So there's a lot of planning elements in the surveying world as well. And that's, unfortunately, I would have liked to actually ask you guys to subdivide this block, to be completely honest, but it was probably it's a bit difficult. And I think it's, it would be a bit unfair on you guys to kind of ask you to provide a subdivision layout. But they're the kind of things that you will, you'll hit in real life, is when you get developers who go, I've got this block of land, subdivide it for me. And there's a lot of things that you actually have to consider, a lot more than just drawing some lines on a block. I might just also take this time to just give a kind of a plug. So those of you who may or may not know, so there's the Planning Institute is essentially the peak body for planners. And every year we normally have a national conference, but because of COVID this year, each state's kind of doing their own little thing, and then there'll be an online version. But there'll be a social event on the 28th of May at Shambles, so it's in Hobart. But basically it'll be, there'll be planners there. There'll be, hopefully, if the new Minister of Planning has been appointed, maybe the Planning Minister might join us as well. But it's a good opportunity for those of you who really are thinking about getting into the industry, to come and have a chat to people. We're all very friendly and often very happy to help with some advice around, what's out there, because, planning at uni looks probably a bit smaller than it actually does in real life. There's a lot of opportunities out there. And in a small place like Tasmania, it is about knowing who's out there and, whose door to knock for help or for assistance when required. So I would highly encourage anyone who is thinking, of potentially being a planner down the track to pop along to the event. I'll be there. So, there'll be one familiar face, hopefully. But, I went with some of my friends back when I was at uni. I took a couple of friends to my kind of conference dinner, and that was good. It was a great way to meet people. And there are connections that you'll have for a long time. So are there any other questions? Like Emma said, I'll be back in week 12 and 13. So week 12, I'll be online and in person, and week 13 online. But if in the meantime, if there are any questions, feel free to flick them to Emma, and Emma will pass them on to me, and I'll try my best to get back as soon as possible. Any questions in the chat bar? I'm just having a look now. So hopefully today was good, and hopefully what I said makes sense. I know sometimes I tend to talk a little fast at times, but yeah, I'm around, and yeah, I've been in the background for a wee while now, so I do know what you guys have been up to for the first part of the unit, and hopefully this is a nice way to finish off, you know, tying everything you've learned into a one final assignment, and something that's relevant, to be honest. You know, if you are heading down that track, it is kind of the problems you will have to face is what do you do with all that extra land that people actually want to develop, and half the time developers want to get the most out of it, so the most blocks, so that they can make the most money.
Hannah asks in the chat, can we include diagrams or maps?
For sure. Yep.
Just
And
look at the unit outline, and it says the task length is maximum 3,000 words, may include photos, screenshots, and other evidence. Word limit includes references. FYI.
The word count is definitely doable. You know, pressures you to make sure you write succinctly, but always, and planners love their maps. We love our figures. Always good to include a map of where you're actually talking about. Yeah, and just, you know, I don't expect you guys to be GIS wizards and make your own maps. Screenshots of the list would be fine as long as you acknowledge that it's from the list. Cool. Are there any questions?
Alan asks, can we put a summary into a table?
I don't see why not. If you can, you think it works. So I'm personally, and I'm known for this, I love tables, because tables, when they work really well. So tables are a great way to, you know, put summary. For example, you know, if you have a site which has, you know, 4 or 5 different types of problems, it may be the best to actually table it up, and say, you know, ecology stuff, you've got this problem, heritage, you've got this problem. But I really emphasize that when tables work, they work, because sometimes when people put tables in, it's just a complete mess and doesn't speak for its own. You know, it doesn't speak on its own, and that's when you have problems. So yep, tables, figures, maps, images, whatever you think that's going to provide, you know, it's going to work for your advice. Really, feel free.
This is really useful. I'm keeping the recording going. Annoying the surveyors because it's now at an hour, because it is better to get this all out sooner rather than later. Having said that, I'm going to stop the recording now so that